Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation from the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. The alchemists claim descent from Hermes, and the Hermetic writings from Egypt of the 1st centuries AD are quoted, frequently word for word. These writings have nothing to do with metallic transformations. They are deeply philosophical and tend to inculcate scorn of the material world, especially of the physical body. In all probability, the chemical or material side is derived from Arabia and has been introduced to hide the esoteric teachings of true alchemy. The materialists were called puffers, and it is from them that modern chemistry has been developed, carefully hidden from the profane, so carefully that most students of their ancient books were deluded into the belief that there was no hidden meaning. Indeed, many so-called alchemists themselves mistook the letter for the spirit, wasting their lives in a vain search for wealth in spite of repeated warnings such as, "Our gold is not the gold of the vulgar." In true alchemy, the conversion of baser metals into gold symbolizes the raising of the lower parts of our human nature to spiritual perfection. Post-Reformation alchemists like Jacob Boehme completely ignored the material side and used the chemical terms in a purely mystical sense. The alchemist hid his secret teachings under the guise of chemical symbols.
For it is most profound philosophy, the subtle science of alchemy.
Our work commences with an assertion of our trust in God and is really completed with the 5 points of fellowship. Raymond Lully, the alchemist and Christian martyr born in 1235, writing of the mystery of the Philosopher's Stone, says,
"It is found in desolate houses, and there is shut up in it a great secret and a treasure enchanted. For desolate houses are poor and penniless, as we start on our journey in search of this lost secret."
The use of gold as a symbol is indeed ancient.
"When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold."
In later days, the Persian poet and mystic Hafiz of the 14th century wrote,
"Like men of the path, wash thy hands of the copper of thine own existence, so that thou mayest acquire the alchemy of love and become pure gold."
True alchemy, also hidden in some of our higher degrees. The famous alchemist Bonus of Ferrari, born approximately 1330, wrote,
"Our art speaks of all things by analogy, and as our secrets have not to do with the external world, but with the inner self, we use signs and symbols by analogy."
Vows of secrecy were insisted upon by all alchemists, perhaps because their philosophy did not agree with the various religions of their times. The Turba Philosophorum, the earliest Latin work on the subject, gives another reason which will appeal to every earnest student. If we hold our secrets to the profane, they would be amused, reminding us of the great saying, "Cast not your pearls before swine." Although oaths of secrecy were required, there is no mention of bodily penalties. Neither are these referred to in the famous Regius manuscript, a Masonic poem of about 1390. Offenders are to be handed over to the sheriff and punished under the ordinary laws of the realm. It is inconceivable that kings, barons, or abbots would surrender their ancient feudal rights and privileges to any company or society of men such as Freemasons. The members of the Court of Admiralty of the Humber in the time of Henry V were styled King's Counsellors, and therefore held the power of life and death in their own hands. A solemn warning against rashness and haste is invariably given by alchemists.
Haste is of the devil's part,
Says Norton in his Ordinal of Alchemy. No entered apprentice can ever forget our symbolic illustration of this warning. Although it is not to the point in this discussion, the following extract from the Gnostics and Their Remains by C.W. King is of interest.
The use of the mazza, a huge mallet, was retained at Rome for the execution of the more atrocious criminals, until the recent introduction of the guillotine.
The three great lights in alchemy were 1. The sun, symbol of spirit, the point within the circle. 2. The moon, symbol of the soul, the semicircle, the human mind. And 3. The earth, symbol of the body, the material world, the square or cube. These are the three great lights of ancient Freemasonry. This perfect symbolism has been weakened by the comparatively modern introduction of 3 other lights, making 6 in all. And 6 is not even a Masonic number. Why did we ever class the man-made square and compasses, even as symbols, above the God-made sun and moon, contradicting the volume of the sacred law in Genesis chapter 1 verse 16. The replacing of the earth by the worshipful master proves that our symbolism was hopelessly misunderstood by the uninspired arrangers of our modern ritual.
That upon which light shines is itself a light.
We must also bear in mind that our veneration for the volume of the sacred law is post-Reformation. Previous to this, its place was always taken by Holy Church, as in the Regius manuscript. The rough ashlar represents the body, or rather, as all our symbolism refers to the inner man and not to the external world of matter, it refers to the animal soul covered by accretions of evil, the animal passions. In the Book of the Dead of ancient Egypt, one of the passwords was, "In strength to bind the animal." The Gnostics of the 1st and 2nd centuries BC and AC taught that the passions were accretions to the soul, or as we say, vain and unbecoming thoughts. When these are removed, we find the perpend ashlar. Not perfect, for the cubic stone itself must eventually be changed, for this vile body must be changed into a spiritual body. In alchemy, this is effected by burning. Burn the copper and destroy its shadow, says the Turba Philosophorum. Now copper is spirit attached to matter, and its shadow is material or animal passions, the accretion of evil with its powerful attraction down to earth.
But verge now downwards. Beneath thee lies a precipice, sheer from the earth that draws one down a stair of 7 steps, beneath which lies the throne of dire necessity.
In Freemasonry, the symbol for earth is the square. In alchemy, it is the Greek mundane cross of 4 equal arms. According to Proclus, Porphyry stated that among the Egyptians, the letter X, surrounded by a circle, symbolized the mundane soul. But Plato asserts that the soul is buried in the body, as in a sepulchre, as we are taught in the 3rd degree. Plutarch, in his vision Aridaris, says,
For you should know that the intercourse and conjunction of the soul with the body is contrary to nature.
Indeed, from at least the time of Plato, matter was looked on as the place of origin of evil.
And that which is separated itself from that which is not, and that which is not is the evil, which has manifested itself in matter.
Separate the clean from the unclean, the substance from its accidents, i.e., the supreme reality from the delusions of the senses, which are dependent on the material world, the substituted secrets which form the veil of the temple and hide the truth from our eyes.
The Lord of the senses has externalized the senses, wherefore we see the external world, and not the God within. The first man is of the earth earthy.
The moon in alchemy was the symbol of the soul, the human intellect. Now, in spite of all the poets who ever wrote, the moon is a dead thing, a memento mori, having no light of its own, capable only of reflecting the light of the sun or the dim reflection of that light from earth. The human intellect has no light which does not reach it through the senses, from the material world, or from spiritual illumination from on high. This higher illumination may be received only when the mind has attained stability. Stability, by preventing the wanderings of the mental processes, is death to the mind, which is essentially inconstant.
Stand still, and thou shalt see the salvation of thy God.
This higher illumination is the stone of the philosophers, the stone which the builders of the external world rejected. It is love, which passeth all understanding, and is hidden from the wise and the prudent. The sun is the alchemical symbol of love, i.e. spirit, and is itself symbolized by the point within the circle. That centre, form which all rays to the periphery are equal, as we read in the very ancient Chaldean oracles.
For God, like a wise architect, sits in the centre of all.
Vaughan also writes,
I say that the true philosophers did find in every compound a double complexion, circumferential and central. The circumferential was corrupt in all things, but in some altogether venomous. The central not so, for in the centre of everything there was a perfect unity, a miraculous indissoluble concord of fire and water.
Sir Thomas Browne, who claims some knowledge of alchemy, writes in Urn Burial,
For life is a pure flame, and we live by an invisible sun within us.
reminding us of the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, the past which burns up, destroys everything, and the future through which we cannot see. In the centre, where the two are conjoined, is the stability of the eternal present. Only when we cease our circumambulations are we taught the proper steps and eventually led to the east.
In the Chaldee-Persian tradition, the worship of the spiritual sun, the Logos, with the natural symbol of the glorious orb of day, which was common in one form or other to all great cults, gradually permeated the popular forms of religion. In the course of time, Mithra, visible sun for the ignorant, the spiritual sun, mediator between light and darkness, as Plutarch tells us, for the instructed, caused his rays to shine to the uttermost limits of the Roman Empire.
The supremacy of spirit is indicated by the arrangement of our symbols on the open volume of the sacred law. First, we have the symbol of earth dominating all. Second, the semicircle moon is indicated and can be drawn. Third, the complete circle with the point in the centre may be drawn with ease, dominating both mind and matter. The human mind tends to claim preeminence. In Isaac Newton's day, men thought that the wonderful discoveries of science would teach them all they needed and would lead them even to the throne of God himself. We find traces of this heresy in the second degree. Newton had no such delusion. He likened himself to a child gathering pebbles on the shore. Today we smile at Brother Alexander Pope, who eulogized Newton thus:
Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light.
or words to that effect, but he was only expressing the idea of his period. There were, however, prophets who refused to bow the knee to Baal. Blake wrote,
"How foolish it is to assert that man is born in only one degree, when that degree is receptive of the 3 degrees, 2 of which he must destroy. Is it not also evident that one degree will not open the other, and that science will not open intellect?"
By intellect, Blake means spiritual insight. Blake was a mystic and knew well the writings of such spiritual alchemists as Swedenborg and Boehm. To return to pure alchemy, let us take the symbols of the metallic elements as a study in pure symbolism. Gold, the point in the centre. Sun, spirit, or love in Freemasonry, hidden under the title of beauty. Silver, the semicircle. Moon, intellect. Earth, the Greek cross, replaced by us by the square. Matter, brute strength, ignorance. Iron, Mars, hatred, the animal soul, spirit dominated by matter. Mercury, the mundane lodge, intellect dominating spirit, which is bound down to matter. Spirit crucified between mind and matter. Zinc, Jupiter, intellect working on the material plane, modern science. Copper, Venus, spirit or love, bound down to matter from which it must eventually be made free. Lead, Saturn, intellect completely dominated by matter. The great work of alchemy, as of Freemasonry, is to make the spirit supreme, when the 3 parts of human nature will become one, though the complete secret is not divulged in craft masonry. The descent from mysteries of Egypt into those of the classical world has been compared with the descent of the soul into material things. It is a false analogy, marking personal predilection, but it connotes an idea of derivation, that Greece inherited from Egypt, nor that at so great a distance. I suppose that the scholars of both subjects would challenge the assumption, which is crude enough in its derivation. The quest of Persephone is not the quest of Isis. The story of the rending of Iacchos has no real connection whatsoever with the dismemberment of Osiris. And those Masonic virtuosos who mistook accidents of analogy for root identity and essential consanguinity were misled herein, as in most of their other reveries. It goes without saying that there is a general likeness between all mystical traditions and all modes of mystical symbolism, because there is a vertical and a vital likeness in all mystical experience. That which is at issue is not a question of descent, but one of common origin in the science of the soul, which science, so far as it existed in Egypt, has the appearance of being more overlaid and encumbered than it was in the classical world. Egypt, however, was the conventional fountainhead for the earlier Masonic literati, and perhaps, after all, the reason is not far to seek. They had heard, on very high authority, that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of Egypt, and they magnified the measures of that wisdom because of the mission of Moses, their mythical first Grand Master. Outside Masonic circles, in those days when the world of learning stood agaze at great masses of hieroglyphical writing which no one could read, Egypt was a world of wonder. It was a mystery written large upon the face of history, and the eyes of learning turned instinctively where Pythagoras had turned his own part. A land of mystery was also the natural accredited home of things that were in themselves mysterious, and it came about in the absence of all evidence that the cryptic literature of alchemy was assigned its origin in the ancient world of the Delta. Mystic alchemy. The question concerns us only for the registration of a definite negative, as a preliminary clearance of issues. So far as concerns the world lying west of China, the earliest alchemical codices are of Byzantine origin and belong to the 4th century AD. This stated, my next purpose is to indicate that in our country and elsewhere there has been much fantastic speculation as to the real purpose which lies behind the intellectual puzzle presented by the literature of transmutation. On the surface, it deals solely and only with the conversion of putative base metals into the modes of gold and silver, which the alchemical hypothesis qualified as perfect metals. Some interpreters of the concealed art have been disposed to regard it as dealing exclusively with the experiences of the soul in its progress, and have said that what was changed in the figurative alembics of philosophers was not metallic substances one into another. On the contrary, it was human nature which was transmuted into a condition that, so far as its form permitted, became akin to divine nature. The lessons of alchemical history and the fuller understanding of its literature do not take us in this direction, and by those who are qualified to judge, there is no question that alchemy is regarded as an experiment made in physics, at least in its primary aspect. Greco-Alexandrian texts. It will be a matter of astonishment to most persons that there should be any need to insist on a point which is, to all appearances, obvious. Some 25 years ago, the researchers of Berthelot, who edited the Byzantine, Arabian, and Syriac alchemists for the first time, read the alternative view, an undesigned but remarkable lesson, which, so far, none of his readers have appreciated. He traced the indubitable metallic experiments of the Greco-Alexandrian period right through medieval times, and exhibited in this manner the physical concern of a long line of Latin-writing adepts in Europe, while he created a strong presumption as to the express objects of the art, by whomsoever practised or essayed. There will be no need to add that with any other point of view which he, as a pure scientist, was quite naturally unacquainted. 2 alchemical schools. All this notwithstanding, the truth seems to lie rather in a middle ground, and the literature as a whole justifies us in regarding the experiment of alchemy as to some extent twofold in its character. This is to say that in part it was a mystery of science, but in part also the symbolism of this science was pressed into the service of another order of experiments. It follows that those who have regarded the soul, its phases and developments, as the particular object of research, have not been far astray in respect of certain schools. The subject has been, unfortunately, too long in the hands of persons who understood neither material alchemy nor the term of mystical research, and it calls for adequate treatment under other auspices. Here I can say only that there came a time when the claims of the work on metals had fallen into serious disrepute, and when there was, by the evidence of the literature, an increasing tendency to use the terminology of alchemy in a transcendental and spiritual sense. Writers like Kunrath seem to have concerned themselves solely with the latter, and when, a little earlier, Jakob Böhm came forward to interpret the secret mysteries of religion, he used largely the symbolical language of alchemy as a ready method of expression. A Masonic analogy. It came about in this manner that Hermetic literature and the practice which lay behind it followed the same course that we are able to trace in Masonry. At a certain period in England, the operative craftsmen and the masters in Masonic arts began to be outnumbered by those whom we call speculative Masons, persons of other business, or perhaps of no occupation, who had been drawn in various manners within the ranks. It would seem that the lodges must, in the effluxion of time, have lost their raison d'etre and survived for social reasons. So also it would appear that experiments in the transmutation of metals were less and less practiced as scientific chemistry emerged slowly into being and provided a practical field where success tended more and more to crown individual effort instead of failure. The old books continued to be studied, but it was by another class of people, with other hopes and dreams. A new construction was placed upon the cryptic symbolism, and there opened out another field of research, having very different ends in view. But just as it is difficult to determine at what period the first elements of a speculative or emblematic masonry arose in the operative art, and just as the researches and tentative hypotheses of writers like R.F. Gould endeavour to put back that period, so does a better and fuller knowledge of alchemical memorials encourage us to recognize a spiritual aspect of the magnum opus, as present far back in the literature, not excluding even certain Byzantine texts. When, in and about the year 1717, emblematic Freemasonry began to assume a definitive and concrete form, it was not for such hypotheses a new thing, although it incorporated new elements. In like matter, when Böhm, Kunrath, and the makers of many other memorials began to speak of eternal things and the mysteries of transmutation in the soul, it was no novel and arbitrary adaptation which began suddenly, for its roots go back, as I have said, and this also may have even been the concern of Zosimus in the 4th or 5th century of the Christian era. Finally, as Mark Masonry, through all its clouded past, has proclaimed its operative concern, and as we have among us at this day a so-called operative body which has come forward recently with a claim on antiquity in an unbroken line of descent, so, in a sporadic fashion, we have continued, on the continent especially, to find the quest of physical alchemy pursued, while a Société Alchimique de la France has existed for a number of years in the interests of the physical work, knowing little or nothing of its alternative, and affirming that it has not been altogether unsuccessful in the path which it has followed. Hermetic Masonry. Many schools of varied zeal, many hopes and dreams, many forms of faith in science, religion, and philosophy gathered under the Masonic banner in the 18th century, above all in France and Germany. It drew within its ranks such alchemy as there was at the period, and there is considerable evidence that it is still a living concern. It came about in due course that Hermetic grades and Hermetic rites grew up. Being numerous and curious, I shall deal with the chief among them in their proper place. In the present one, it calls to be said that, except in Rosicrucian circles, which were also Masonic, there is very little to connect either the founders or the members with a serious pursuit of the practical side of metallic alchemy. The rituals, for the most part, are unfortunately not available, for which reason, and also on other grounds, it should be understood that I am not adjudicating in any authoritative manner, but rather conveying an impression on the facts of the evidence before me. There is, perhaps, no subject which commandeered the whole man and his undivided attention like the research of alchemy pursued in the domain of metals. But there is nothing so scattered in concern and so apart from the life of the laboratory as are the histories of people like Abbé Panetti and Baron Chowdy, to name two Masons who stand out prominently in the history of Hermetic Masonry. I have no doubt that they followed chemical experiments, as and when their scattered and sporadic opportunities permitted. But they led restless lives, and both were men of numerous activities, who carried the dossiers of several distinct interests. Their practical researches bore no proportion to the reality of their theoretical interest, and I think that they pursued alchemy as others pursued mesmerism under the Masonic aegis. Their studies were those of the student's closet rather than the laboratory. It is to this fact that we owe the works of Panetti and the Hermetic Catechism of Chowdy. On the other hand, there is no trace in either of the spiritual side of the Hermetic work. For Baron Chowdy, Masonry may be described as moralized alchemy, while in the alchemical writings of Panetti there is no trace of Masonry at all, as there is no derivation of moral or mystical lessons. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons for Freemasons. Visit FromTheQuarries.com or YouTube at From the Quarries.